he went after and drove out of business a grandmother, a Christian grandmother named Baronelle Stutzman in our state, who was a florist. And again, she would sell flowers to everyone, but she would not create special arrangements to honor a gay wedding. They could buy the flowers for her, but she didn't want to participate and actually actively participate. And she should have been able to do that. Her chief persecutor in our state was not an atheist. It was a self-described Catholic Christian who actually wrote an article at the time using his faith as justifying what he was doing to her.
Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Alisa Childers podcast. I'm Alisa Childers, and it's always my goal to equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And this is an episode today that I have been wanting to bring you for such a long time, and I can't wait to get into it. But today's episode is brought to you by Brave Books. It's a children's entertainment company, and you can go to bravebooks.com, use my code Childers for 20% off your first order. Well, I mentioned I've been very excited to bring you this episode. A while back, I read a book called Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, and I immediately started recommending it to all my friends. It's written by John G. West, who is the vice president and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and he was a professor at Seattle Pacific University for many years. Now, the reason I thought his book was so important for this moment for Christians right now is because he's really identifying a lot of the challenges that are coming to Christians, but not necessarily through secularists or atheists, but really through our own Christian leaders who have bought into the ideas of secularism. So if you're unfamiliar with Stockholm Syndrome, it's a psychological state where somebody begins to relate with their captor, somebody who has them held hostage or kidnapped, and they begin to relate with the goals of their abuser, the ideologies of their abusers, and it's called Stockholm Syndrome. So John G. West has identified what he's calling Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, where many of our evangelical leaders have been taken captive by some of the secular ideas. They're empathizing now with a lot of the secular goals and bringing those things into the church. And what I loved specifically about this book is how specific he was about identifying where these different challenges are coming in. And I was particularly moved, especially in this episode, as we talked through his story of being a professor at Seattle Pacific University and watching this formerly really conservative Christian university get on that slippery slope toward progressivism and how that happened just a little bit of a drift at a time. And I know that many of you have written in, you've seen this happen at other Christian universities, but not just universities and Bible colleges. We're seeing this happen in churches. We're seeing it happen in Christian institutions and parachurch ministries. And so today's episode is so important. But I also want to strongly recommend this book. If there's a book you need to make sure you read this year, let it be Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. It is such an important critique of the current cultural moment that we find ourselves in as Christians, but it's also filled with hope, because wherever there is truth, there is hope. We know that God is a God of love and he is a God of truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And we know that it's the truth that will set us free. So when we can identify where these ideas are coming in, we will be better equipped to combat them in our families, churches, organizations, schools, wherever we may find them. So without any further ado, I'm going to take you to John G. West. Well, John, so glad to have you on the show. I loved your book, and we're going to get into so much today. But for anyone who might be unfamiliar with who you are, would you please tell us who you are and where you currently work and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I'm a vice president of a place called Discovery Institute, which is a think tank based out of Seattle, probably most notorious, at least in the Christian community, for supporting scientists who think there's evidence of intelligent design in nature, people like Michael Behe and Steve Meyer, Bill Dembski, and others. My own background is in the social sciences. I have a PhD in political science, and I was a college professor for many years, for 12 years at Seattle Pacific University, a historically evangelical Christian university. I'm sure we'll talk about that. And I was department chair there, had tenure before I decided to go back to discovery full time. And so that's me. I've written books. I'm particularly interested in the influence of science and scientism, sort of the abuse of science on culture, on ethics, on politics, things like eugenics, social Darwinism, scientific racism. But I'm also interested in things like religious liberty and American constitutionalism. I've done some films and documentaries. Probably my biggest one on that is called Human Zoos, which is sort of the history of Darwinian racism. That has about close to 5 million views now on YouTube organically. I mean, we didn't actually do much promotion of that. And so that's just a little bit about me.
Yeah, and you guys over at the Discovery Institute were instrumental in helping my faith rebuild after I had a really serious time of doubt. And of course, I've had Stephen Meyer on the podcast. And so I love you guys over there. I love the work that you're doing. And you've been just a sort of like this bulwark against evolution, but also to take another. Why don't you just briefly define what intelligent design is? What are you talking about when you say intelligent design? And why is it controversial?
Sure. So intelligent design is the idea that there's really empirical evidence from nature that we're the product of a purposeful process, a creator, not just a blind, undirected process. And that's really many people, there are lots of debates among Christians about age of the earth and other things, and I don't really get into that. But the central thesis of Darwin's theory is that it was an unguided process, and that if there was a God, at the most, he sort of set things rolling and didn't know how they were going to turn out. And that's at most. The standard evolutionary view is random mutations and natural selection dispose of any need for a creator or guidance. You can get what looks like something that was created through a blind, unguided process. And so intelligent design is, well, no, actually, if you look at nature from the origin of the universe to the fine tuning of the laws of the universe that make life possible, to the origin of life from non-life, to the development of things like human beings, the levels of complexity and purpose and the layers. I mean, just since you've talked to Steve Meyer, it's not just the DNA code, but we're now finding overlapping codes over codes over codes in the same part of, the gene structure. And so you have overlapping messages. It's like you have one English sentence that can be read 10 different ways with 10 different messages, encrypted in it. This is just screams design. Now, why is this controversial? Well, because sort of the atheist creation story, if you will, is that things are blind matter in motion and that we're not the product of a purposeful creator. And so, as long as a Christian is willing to say, oh, well, this is my fairy story, this is my subjective faith, and I'm not claiming that there's anything real about it, then you might get along. But as soon as you say, well, no, actually, you look at the world and the evidence points to this, then people get upset. Even
Yeah.
some fellow Christians, as I found out. So.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. Well, you've written a book called Stockholm Syndrome Christianity: Why America's Christian Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. I devoured this book. I absolutely devoured it. The second I finished this book, I thought, I have to move heaven and earth to get this guy on the podcast, because this is the book for this moment. And I really want to encourage my audience, guys, pick up this book. And you were even sharing with me before we went on the air that you even had trouble getting this book published because you're calling out a lot of things that are challenging the Christian infrastructure of the publishing world and all sorts of different things in similar fashion to what Megan Basham did with her book, Shepherds for Sale, for which you were a big supporter of hers. And I appreciate that. But I'd love for you I want to talk about your story, because your story is so important to help us understand how deception works and how it can be sort of disarming and how it can come from a place that you wouldn't expect it and how we always have to be on our guard. But before we get there, what is Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, and why did you feel like you needed to write this book right now?
Yeah. Before answering that, let me just piggyback on you said, there was a lot of pushback. And I think people need to ask why they're not hearing certain things. And Megan Basham's book, there was, as you said, was a tremendous effort to get people not to read it. I had a top Christian agent who shopped this book around, and there was one particular, and I'm not going to mention the publisher, but it's identified as not a woke Christian publisher, but as a conservative Christian publisher. I had to give a list of everyone criticized in the book. And when the name Andy Stanley came up, that nixed the book. The staff were interested in it, but the higher ups, well, we can't criticize him. And so I just encourage people to look around what is unfortunately, and this isn't true of all Christian publishers, but a lot of them, they're not they're not addressing some of the issues that are really challenging the Christian community, and that's a problem. But
Hmm.
getting to sort of the why I wrote the book, I really did have a burden for this over a few years, and I think the one insight. So, as conservative Christians, theologically conservative Orthodox Christians, I think we often tend to, and I know myself have done this, look at the big bad atheists or agnostics or the woke. That's all their responsibility. They're destroying the culture. Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I began to see in my work, both as a college professor and then at Discovery, that a lot of very self-identified, personally even Orthodox devout Christians in leading positions were enabling this, and they were pushing it forward. And so I began to realize that, well, we sort of need to look inside ourselves. I mean, how can we be salt and light to if we're not being salt and light, how can we expect people outside of Christianity to do something? So that was one of the questions. And then, I think it's often, we think that, well, people are just sellouts or they're cowardly or this and that. And I do think is attraction to the world. So I don't discount that. But when I viewed my own personal experience with fellow faculty members, with other Christian leaders, I saw that many of them sincerely thought that they were often even standing for truth, but they were all whacked out. And
Right.
so I gravitated to this idea, and I know it's controversial in psychology, but I think it really does understand what I've seen, Stockholm Syndrome. So this was, for a reminder of people, back in the 1970s, there was an infamous bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. And these bank robbers with submachine guns took several hostages. And then something strange happened. About after 100 hours of being held hostage, some of the hostages were expressing love or gratitude or toward their captors. Not toward the police, not toward how they were rescued, but toward their captors. They were feeling gratitude toward their captors. And I think that this is something, especially for Christians who are going to leadership in the media, the ministry, academia, the entertainment media, is that if they've spent their life either in graduate school or then in their professions surrounded by people who are largely, I'd say, captive to other sort of elites that are largely hostile to Orthodox Christianity, one result of that for some people is to basically start to adopt their point of view. So you're surrounded by elites that are hostile to Orthodox Christianity, and you start actually believing what they say is true. You're still personally a Christian, but you start adopting their assumptions, you start adopting their critiques of Christianity. And so rather than being salt and light, say, from Christianity and showing Christian truth to the world, you almost become a missionary from the secularists to Christians. And you're more concerned about, well, the Christians aren't really getting where it's at because they're clinging to these outdated beliefs and again, these people think they're being courageous in talking to their fellow Christians when in fact
Right.
they're really buying off in the world. And so that's what I saw. And I thought, maybe I have something that I could say about this because I didn't see that being addressed as much as I think it could be. So,
Yeah, very good. Well, again, everybody needs to pick up the book. It's called Stockholm Syndrome Christianity: Why America's Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. And one of the things that I think brought this into clear focus was your story of being at Seattle Pacific University and how that slowly drifted. I have parents of college age kids almost every night when I go and speak ask me, where's a good place to send my kid to college? Or they'll say, oh, we're going to a good solid college, and then they'll say the name of the college, and I'm like, well, I feel like that meme that, Debbie Downer, like, actually, that's not
yeah.
the safest place to send your kid now. And I think this may have come more into focus on social media recently when some tweets about what was going on at Wheaton, people were like,
Mhm.
Wheaton, I mean, this is Billy Graham, this is where Elizabeth Elliot went, what is going on at Wheaton? And we're seeing Wheaton drift, and I can't recommend Biola anymore. And so that really
Yeah.
surprises a lot of people. But your story gives us a clear picture of how this mission drift happens. And I think people like you, people that have been through this, you're not as surprised when you see that the institutions that you had trusted are starting to drift, and you're a little bit more concerned because you know that how it can happen. So I'd love for my audience to get to
Yeah.
hear what happened to you and what happened to Seattle Pacific University.
Yeah.
Well, as you can see from this episode, the deceptions out there are very sophisticated. Sometimes they can be very hard to see through. So it is never too early to start equipping our kids as Christian parents to have a biblical worldview on everything from how to study the Bible, world religions, critical thinking, and biblical sexuality. That's why I'm so excited to tell you about Foundation Worldview Curriculum. This is my go-to resource for kids ages 4 to 12. So whether you have a preschooler, elementary student, or preteen, Foundation Worldview has a curriculum that's designed for their developmental stage, and it covers biblical thinking, biblical literacy, and God's good design for sexuality. Give it a try in your home. You can also use this as a part of your Sunday school curriculum. Go to foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa for 10% off of any family license. Again, that's foundationworldview.com. Use my code Alisa.
So Seattle Pacific University was established. Well, first, the big picture is many Christians don't know that the original universities and colleges in America, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Dartmouth, were all founded as explicitly Christian institutions, often in their mottos, to spread the gospel. By the mid-19th century, many of them had fallen away, were believing in Unitarianism, not thinking Jesus was God, not really accepting the Bible as an authority. And so to their credit, evangelical Christians in America in the latter part of the 19th century basically started anew. They lost the first generation of institutions, and so they established all sorts of institutions. I actually think Wheaton was mid-19th century. Seattle Pacific was in the 1890s by the Free Methodists. And so you had these institutions that really wanted to bring Christian truth back to the culture. And then for decades they did. But what we've seen in the past few decades, and it's been rise or fall, but especially the last decade, that unfortunately a lot of these same institutions that were founded to go back to biblical faith are now themselves going in the really the way that Harvard, Princeton, Yale did. And I think a lot of people are shocked because when they see it, they see something like at Seattle Pacific. It's not as well known as Wheaton, but it did get some national notoriety just 2 or 3 years ago when the faculty had a vote about the university's statement on biblical marriage, which is a pretty basic statement. But basically, it was actually adopted while I was there. But it was that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's where sex should take place. And it's a pretty basic statement. 72% of the faculty basically voted against that and were upset with the board for not repealing it. And I sort of asked the question, well, how do you have a Christian institution when more than 70% of the faculty are against biblical marriage? Well, the answer is you don't have a Christian institution anymore.
Right.
And a lot of people were shocked by that, and they think, they were happy that the board of directors didn't officially repeal it. But what they didn't see is, but how do you get to the situation where over 7 in 10 of the faculty, and I think that I do have some insight into that. So when I got there in the sort of mid to late 90s, it was a devout institution. It had gone through some things, but had a board of trustees at the time that was really trying to bring things back. And in fact, I tell the story in the book. It sort of bookends my time there that will sort of provide some perspective. When I got there, I was warned by some fellow faculty members, we have a very conservative board of trustees. They just denied tenure to someone in the theology department because they were, too liberal theologically. And they were warning me as if I would be concerned. Secretly, I was going, yeah, that's great. They actually take the mission of the university seriously. Fast forward to 12 years from there, when I decided to leave, one of the last things I did was try to help a fellow faculty member who is, in my view, one of the best, most evangelical, on fire professors that we hired while I was there. And he was being denied tenure by the faculty, basically, in my view, because he was too conservative. And there, the board just rubber stamped it. So you went from a board, and that in a nutshell is, if you want to know why many of these Christian institutions are failing, in my view, to uphold the faith, it's not just, yes, there are woke faculty, and they try to reproduce themselves, no question. But the deciding point, in my view, is the governance, and the board of trustees, which often is personally faithful. In my at Seattle Pacific, these were both appointed by the Free Methodist Church, but also in the business community. There were leaders of, I won't name the parachurch ministries, but leaders, Bible study leaders, and very conservative parachurch ministries involved in missions to China, all sorts of things. They were personally orthodox, no question.
Yep.
The problem is, when push came to shove, they they didn't have the same courage of their convictions or backbone that the woke faculty did.
Yes.
And I describe this in my book. Well, struggle. I actually have more struggles in dealing with the fact that these biblically faithful people who were appointed to be leaders of the university, and the number one thing was to defend the integrity of the institution, that they refused to do that. Then I do feel at the president at the time or others who are really pushing the envelope because, well, in some sense, they thought what they were doing was right, even though I think it was wrong. At least they had the courage of their wrong convictions. And
Right.
I think that institution, if you actually look at a lot of these institutions that fail, it doesn't happen all at once. And it also isn't just enabled. The key people who, in my view, are enabling are personally biblically orthodox people often,
Yes.
but they're not consistent and they're not willing to have the courage of their convictions.
Well, and I
And there
think
was a
that's
really,
always the way it is, isn't it, when there's a drift? I think it was Al Mohler. I was actually just trying to find it, but he was talking about the fundamentalist modernist split back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was pointing out that it wasn't it wasn't really the liberals that were the most responsible for the drift of all the churches and the institutions. It wasn't the conservatives that were outspoken and living out the courage of their convictions. That's great, but it was the massive amount of people in the mushy middle that
yeah,
didn't agree with the liberal theology but wouldn't speak up against it. And that is what we see. Like, even when I was reading in your book and you were talking about how the board wouldn't give him tenure, and I'm thinking, why is he still employed, let alone tenure? It's like, if somebody
yeah.
isn't withholding the statement of faith or teaching according to the mission of the institution, why are they still there? Well, it's because of the mushy middle.
That's true. In fairness of that, I mean, meaning that he didn't get tenure, so then he was out,
Oh,
and
okay.
and
Okay.
so tenure. Once you come up, if you fail tenure, then you get a terminal contract and
Okay.
you're
I
kicked out.
didn't know
So
that because I have a high school diploma and I never did the whole academic thing. So that's thank you for clarifying
that's
that for
probably
me.
why you're sane. I mean, there's so
Right.
much that is.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me started. Even though I was a college professor, and I think there's value that. There's so many problems that
Yeah.
now, in our educational system, and people learn in different ways, and probably one of the least cost effective way is the way we've set up the university structure. So
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, but yeah, so that was really the key. And what I saw, and you raised a really good question, what really disturbed me is I saw really devout Christian parents who are mortgaging their future, going into great deal of debt to send their kids to our school, thinking that they were going to get this integration. And even, while I was there, even when the board at the beginning was trying to do something, professors were teaching, for example, that God doesn't know the future. And
Wow.
okay, there's something called
It's
open
like open
theism.
theism. Yeah.
It was, and we had speakers. I was a lowly, political science professor, but I had students, advisees come in distraught. So I tried to help them and give them the other side. But in their theology courses, they were getting this, let alone a lot of other things. And it was, ironically, at the very time the university was sliding and hiring more and more heterodox people, they had done a marketing study that, well, their niche was the evangelicals who were conservative, and so the messaging, the PR became more distinctly Christian while I was there. Come here for faith integration, while what was happening in the classroom was getting further and further away. Now, I will say that for parents who are looking, it is hard to find a great Christian school because even if they were good 5 years ago, it doesn't mean they're good now. And so, actually, on my website for the book in the resources section, so Stockholm Syndrome Christianity.com, if you go on the resources, one of the things I have is 10 questions to ask when you're considering a Christian college. And so I do think
Good.
there are a lot of things that you can do. And just here's one, for example. You may not be able to know what's in the classroom, but you can find out now, especially post-COVID, most of these are posted. Who do they invite to chapel? Do they
Right.
invite people like, say, Rosaria Butterfield, who stands true on gender and sexuality issues? Do they invite pro-life speakers? Do they invite people who are arguing in behalf of the biblical historicity of the Bible? Or is it a never-ending succession of woke people? That
Yeah.
will tell you a lot. And that's something that's harder to hide. And so, but there are a lot of other things. You can ask questions. Does the campus health center refer people to Planned Parenthood?
Good
I
question.
mean, there are a lot of questions that you can ask that will elicit, even from, I mean, I'll say even in my school, even though it got, so the PR was much more Christian than the school. If you ask some of these questions, the people weren't going to lie to you. They would tell you, but of course, they sort of didn't want you to ask the questions. And
Hmm.
there is a way to find out, decent Christian schools if you just know the questions to ask.
Pretty much the first thing I do every single morning when my feet hit the ground is I head over to my espresso machine and I make myself an Americano with half and half. I love it. I love coffee. I look forward to it every single morning. And very often, that coffee that I put in my espresso machine is my espresso beans that I get from 7 Weeks Coffee. I get a pound of these shade grown, low acid, organically farmed, pesticide free, mold free beans every single month. And it is the best coffee that I've ever had. But it's not just how good the coffee is that I love this company. It's because they are unapologetically Christian and pro-life. And they give 10% of every sale to pregnancy resource centers all across the country. They've raised over $1 million, which means they have gotten to save thousands of lives. And you can be a part of that as well. When you subscribe to 7 Weeks Coffee right now, you're going to get 2 single-serve brew bags to take your coffee with you wherever life takes you. It is so good. I really encourage you to try it because not only will you get the best coffee you've ever had, but you're going to support the pro-life cause. Go to 7weekscoffee.com. Use my code Alisa to get an additional 10% off. But if you subscribe to the Heartbeat Club, where you're going to get your beans sent to you each month like I do, you'll get an automatic 15% off. So if you go to 7 Weeks Coffee, use my code Alisa, you're going to get 10% more. So go to 7weekscoffee.com, use my code Alisa for up to 25% off. Yeah, very good. And I was thinking recently about Charles Spurgeon and the downgrade controversy. This was a battle that he found himself embroiled in, where, of course, he knew the difference between essential doctrines and secondary issues that we can, and he had fellowship with Christians that he disagreed with
Mhm.
about, should we go to the theater or send our kids to public schools and things like that. But the hills that he said he was going to die on were the errors that his other colleagues were making in the areas of denying the infallibility of the scripture. It's always the Bible, right? That's always going to be a part of it. The necessity and substitutionary nature of Christ's atonement,
Yep,
the doctrine of hell, and then the affirmation of universalism, which was very, very similar to what J. Gresham Machen was fighting against
yep,
a little bit later than that. And then one of the maybe most recent ones was about 24 years after J. Gresham Machen died. That's when Pete Enns was born. So I kind of like to think about the timeline of
yeah.
this. It's not like all these hundreds of years go by. So Pete Enns is born. He ends up a seminary professor at Machen's University that Machen had founded to preserve historic Christian
Yes.
doctrine. And
Yeah.
then he came out with a book in 2005 called The Inspiration and Incarnation, Evangelicals and the Problem of the Old Testament. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's your chapter 1 in your book is called Merely Human. And that is the view of the Bible that often gets promoted that people don't, and it gets slipped in. And so maybe an example here was Pete Enns when he came out with this book that was wanting to redefine the doctrine of inspiration, which ultimately is going to come down to inerrancy. And so at Westminster, what the debate was really about wasn't so much like, is he in error, is this, but does this book fit within our definition of inerrancy? That was the debate. And it was split. It's not like it was unanimous. Now, thankfully, Westminster voted correctly, but it's not like it was unanimous. The book was published on a conservative publishing house. It was endorsed by conservative scholars. He was supported by other conservative scholars. But if you look at Pete Enns today, he is like the scholar of progressive Christianity. He's promoting Richard Rohr, pro-LGBTQ, all the
Um,
things, right? And so I want to read this quote because this, I thought, was really insightful. So where is it here? It was the president, Peter Loback, I think it was a Christianity Today article back when this controversy was happening about Pete Enns' book. He said, "We have students who have read it say that it has liberated them. We have other students say it's crushing their faith and removing them from their hope. Isn't that interesting that a redefinition of inspiration could set some students in their own minds free? Like, oh, liberate. Well, of course, yeah, they feel liberated because they don't have to obey it anymore. They don't have to be under its authority. But for the other ones, probably the true Christians, it was crushing their faith, removing them from their hope. And this is a battle we see over and over again. So I'd love for you to talk about Stockholm Syndrome Christians, like this dismissive view they have of the Bible.
You're exactly right. And I intentionally started the first chapter about biblical authority because I do think everything else flows from that. And you're right. I'm glad you brought up Machen. That it's not as if Christians haven't had to deal with this before, and it's a defining moment of your generation. And I think there were a lot of faithful people in Machen's era, and that's good. In the 1970s, when a lot of the debates over inerrancy took place, you had that again. I tell some of the stories in there. Francis Schaeffer was a key, figure in
Yeah.
there. But I think we are now seeing that yet again. And the question is, are we going to rise to the challenge? And so many people, so much of even conservative evangelicalism is what I say a good old boys club. And so if you have the right relationships, you don't get called out, and that's how errors become,
Yeah.
you know, from fringe to go to center. And so, one of the people I talk about two people in particular in that chapter that I think people need to know about, and some I think people will know now about Andy Stanley, the son of Charles Stanley. But his book, Irresistible, that basically trashed the Old Testament and even said it should be called the obsolete Testament. So he actually says we should revise our Bibles to move the Old Testament to the back. And this book, and I'm not going to call these people out, but there were some major theologically conservative, even Christian apologists who endorsed that book. Now, maybe they didn't read it. I was shocked by one of them, and I actually need to talk about this to this person to see if they revise their opinion. But this was a book that was not at all helpful at all. And just to be clear, yes, Jesus fulfills the Old Testament law. I mean, Christians have always understood that. So no one's claiming that everything in the Old Testament is understood in the same way by Christians
Right.
as it was originally in the Old Testament, since Jesus has fulfilled the sacrificial system. But that's not what he was talking about. And he was blaming basically everything Christians are doing wrong because they believe in the vengeful God of the Old Testament. This is really repackaged theological liberalism from the
Yeah.
17th, 18th centuries. And by a leading megachurch pastor, I was at a fairly conservative Presbyterian church for many years where I was an elder, and we were instructed to read Andy Stanley because he styles himself as he's training thousands of pastors, evangelical pastors, or at least formerly evangelical pastors around the world. Yet he doesn't call out. And I was actually sharing with you before, one of the publishers that was interested in my book axed it because I called out Andy Stanley. And this was not a woke
Yeah.
Christian publisher. And
Right.
so, but then even more concerning to me actually is someone who is named Mike Licona. And Mike Licona is at Houston Christian University, and he's done some great work in the past defending the historicity of the resurrection. But in the last several years, he's wanting to redefine inerrancy as what he calls flexible inerrancy. But let's get to the devil is in the details. Literally, he says that the gospel accounts are like Hollywood movies about, say, a biography of someone that's inspired by true events, but where the script writers basically change the facts, the situations, even the words of the major characters to fit whatever they are wanting to tell. This is not inerrancy. This is old
Right.
style. I mean, this is Jesus Seminar Light. I mean, if people remember the old Jesus Seminar
Yeah.
where liberal theologians would vote on whether this was an authentic saying of Jesus, and if they didn't get a majority vote, that wasn't. I mean, this is what he's actually doing, down to the words of Jesus. Again, no one says that they had tape recorders, that everything was verbatim, but the Christians have always believed that this is an authentic description, accurate description of what Jesus said. But that's not what
Right.
Michael Licona is saying. Just one example that I think crystallizes it. In the Synoptic Gospels, you have, they give that Jesus says, really quoting Psalm 22. It's an amazing. Psalm 22 is an amazing prophecy of Jesus on the cross, where on the cross he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Well, in John, he gives some additional details, and so he doesn't give that. He says, well, Jesus said, I thirst. Jesus said both. But according to Mike Licona, John rewrote, my God, why have you forsaken me?" as I thirst.
Right.
Now, that's not paraphrase. I mean, if
Right.
we got 1,000 people in the room right here and asked them to, well, give, a paraphrase of my God, why have you forsaken me? I would wager not one would come up with I thirst. I mean, he's
Right.
basically saying that you can't trust the account of the words of Jesus. No matter, I mean, he says he is, oh, I trust it. And he has a conservative theological view about Jesus as a savior and biblical sexuality. But his approach to the Bible, once you start preaching that, is just, this is not evangelical Christian. This is not historic Catholic teaching or Eastern
Right.
Orthodox teaching about the Bible. And yet, I know so many people and friends, including someone who wouldn't endorse the book because of this, who won't speak out about Michael Cohen
Yeah.
because of their friendship with him. And some are even giving him a platform for promoting views that are just, if it was anyone else, they'd recognize it was theological liberalism. And yet he
That's
has a
right.
platform to teach new generations
Yes.
of, of evangelicals, and I would say lead them away from the historic faith.
Almost all the meat that we eat in our home comes from goodranchers.com. And one of my daughter's favorite comfort meals is to take the better than organic chicken breasts from Good Ranchers, marinate them in Italian dressing for a few hours, put them on the grill, and then serve them on hoagie rolls and provolone cheese. We just had that this last week, and it is so good. And it's so easy and convenient knowing that that high quality meat is just sitting there in my freezer. And that's one of the reasons I love Good Ranchers. That's because all of the meat is born, raised, and harvested in the USA. And if you subscribe to Good Ranchers today, you're going to get to pick a free meat add-on for the life of your subscription. So you can choose between the Wagyu burgers, which are so good. We have those all the time, the hot dogs, bacon, or chicken wings in every box for the lifetime of your subscription. So go to goodranchers.com today. Use my code Alisa to get the free add-on plus $40 off your first box and free express shipping. So go to goodranchers.com, use my code Alisa, goodranchers.com, American meat delivered. Well, I agree with you. I think we are at a very that's why I brought up Spurgeon with the downgrade controversy. You have J. Gresham Machen with the battles they had there. And then, of course, at Westminster, the battles they had over Pete Enns and the reason I brought out that about Pete Enns is because Pete Enns was a conservative Bible scholar at the time. And nobody would have thought that this would be coming from inside our ranks. And I think the thing that is hard, the hardest thing, it's easy to call out people that aren't in your camp. It's easy to call out what you see outside of your camp. And it's hard, and it takes a special kind of courage to do it within your own camp. And that certainly doesn't mean you put someone on blast and question their salvation or anything like that.
Sure.
But there has to be accountability within the group. So what we're seeing now happen with this proposed redefinition of inerrancy from Lacona is coming from within the apologetics community. And I was recently at an event where I sort of alluded to this, and I quoted that quote from President Peter Lilback of Westminster because for me, again, I'm not a scholar, but I can look and see the effect this is going to have on the average Christian. When my faith was in shambles and I learned principles of hermeneutics, when I learned the doctrine of inerrancy, it all made sense to me. Things like, hey, when we're talking about inerrancy, we're not saying that there aren't any paraphrases. Obviously, Sermon on the Mount, it takes about 7 minutes to read that. It was probably longer than that, so it might be condensed in a bit of a paraphrase, but everything that you read in the Sermon of the Mount is what Jesus said. There's a difference between that and putting words in Jesus' mouth that he did not say. That is going to have cataclysmic effects on the faith of young people that can't necessarily be confident with that when they read something Jesus said, that he actually said it. And I don't think you're exaggerating to say it's Jesus Seminar Light. Now, of course, there are debates and there are some people who have kind of quietly spoke. There's like Lydia McGrew has spoken out quite fervently, and there are some who've endorsed her. But I want to see more people even pulling their friend aside to say, look, this is not okay. This is not going to work. And again, it is, we are here again. And I want to just encourage my viewers and listeners to think about parsing categories this way. To say that somebody is proposing something dangerous, you're not saying they're a bad person or that everything they believe is terrible. I've been thankful for some of the work of Mike Licona in the past. I think he was very clear, like you said, on the resurrection in spots. Although, again, I think it started back then because that's
It
when he
did.
was redefining part of the genre of Matthew to be apocalyptic literature, which would say that the people who rose from their tombs after Jesus was resurrected, that didn't really happen. And that was sort of the
Yes.
beginning of this. And I remember reading his book, Why Are There Contradictions in the Gospels? And at first, I was kind of excited about the proposed solutions. I was like, this might be really cool. I'd heard him interviewed a couple of times. And I started to read the book. And for a couple of things, I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But then I'm reading like, oh, okay, wait, what? It can still be inerrant, but actually lie? That doesn't make sense. And so I really appreciate, because you're one of the very, very few people who have really had the courage to say, we have to at least put up a big stop sign on this thing. And I would never suggest we shut down debates, but we have to consider the weight of what we're debating. And I'm not really seeing that.
And there aren't enough people rising to the occasion to even to debate it. They're just allowing him to, hold court. And I think, I feel for, I don't personally know Mike Licona, but I've read his interviews of how he struggled with doubts about the faith through the years, and I have great compassion for
Sure.
that, because that. But again, you also have to think about, and I think some of his friends are thinking, well, they're compassionate toward him, but you're not being compassionate to him if he's going in a unhealthy direction. But you're also not being compassionate about the people who are going to struggle or be led away from the faith because
That's
of
right.
this view. And I just think that is something that I wish some of his friends would actually more, take up. And let me say something else. I do subscribe to a traditional view of inerrancy, but I want to point out that there were people like C.S. Lewis and others who didn't fully agree, and Lydia McGrew wouldn't
Right.
identify with
Yeah,
inerrancy.
she's not even an inerrantist. That's
And,
interesting, huh?
and so my point is that even if you're listening here and you think, well, maybe there are some errors in something you do, but what he's proposing is so far out. I mean, that you can't trust virtually anything. I mean, if they change the events, like you mentioned, the secondary resurrection of the saints that Matthew records, that was always considered historical by the church. So you create completely new events. You so paraphrase things that you're not really paraphrasing. You're creating complete new sayings of Jesus. You're changing the location, the timing. I mean, this is not even this isn't C.S. Lewis. This isn't even people who say, well,
Right.
there are some minor errors or something. This is like a frontal assault, whatever he says. I mean, I'm not saying psychologically he's sold himself that he's sort of defending the faith, but in reality, in objective reality, this is so different from the historic Christian teaching, and it's what, like Lydia McGrew says, he does these unforced errors. I mean, there are a few, very few, hard things that we don't quite know how to
Sure.
reconcile, maybe, but the things he's talking about are not those things.
Right.
I mean, you
Right,
know,
right,
the fact that Jesus says, that the different accounts focus on different things he's saying is not contradictory.
right.
The idea that simple statements, I mean, he raises questions about the historicity of really simple statements like, I am the light of the world. Well, if anything can be virtually verbatim, it would be those simple declarative statements, because that will stick in your mind. So it's like he's searching for a problem, in many cases, a solution to a problem that doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Well, and I think what we all need to be willing to do is, of course, in love, but speak truth and I think also one thing that can keep people from speaking out necessarily, and I've experienced a little bit of this as much as I've tried to insulate myself from joining bigger groups. I've tried, I always say I'm not a joiner because I see people go off cliffs together because they won't challenge each other. And so I typically won't come under the umbrella of something else. Of course, I'm accountable to my pastors and my husband and my family and other people in my life. But I think I have a little bit more freedom to do things like that. But I've lost I've lost people. I've been uninvited to events. I've lost people who have worked advocating for me because of calling out things that maybe got a little too close to their person that they like. And I think we all have to be willing to be uninvited to things. We have to be willing as Christians to even lose our jobs if necessary, to speak truth. And even sadly, I mean, you don't want to lose relationships, but a true friend, someone who really loves somebody else, will speak truth to them. And so I appreciate you bringing this out. Now, certainly, this is not the case, what we're about to talk about with Lacona. As far as I know, he still completely holds to a biblical sexual ethic. But very often, when people do redefine inerrancy or inspiration, as in the case of Pete Enns, it's the whole sexuality conversation will come next. And you call it sexual suicide in your book. As a parent, I'm always asking what's shaping my kids' hearts and minds, because let's face it, a lot of the content out there is confusing, it's shallow, or even worse, it's completely opposed to a biblical worldview. This is why I love what Brave Books is doing. They're a Christian children's entertainment company that helps parents raise kids with character conviction and imagination. When I was a little girl, I used to watch shows like Davy and Goliath, and they taught me about being courageous. They taught me honesty and integrity and instilling me with really good values and the fear of God. And that's what I love about Brave Books. So right now you can get 20% off your first purchase by going to bravebooks.com and using the code Childers. They also have a streaming platform called Brave Plus, which has a lot of those great shows that some of us were raised on, and even some new ones as well. So go to bravebooks.com, use my code Childers for 20% off. Again, bravebooks.com, use my code Childers.
And I will say you're right that I do think, I mean, I trust Lacona's statement in his most recent book that he has still traditional views on all those things, but you are right that this often does get progressive, because if your light is, and I think in his case it's he's really listening too much to secular scholarship that is informed by assumptions that really aren't biblical or in line with reality. And so if that is your lodestar that you're listening to, as the secular culture gets worse, you're going to move right along with it. And I actually have a later chapter about the slippery slope, and you can see this. It's really tragic in the area of, say, Darwinism and intelligent design. There was a physicist at Calvin University, Howard Van Til, who first raised objections to sort of intelligent design in biology. How can we go against Darwin? And he came up with an explanation that was sort of, I mean, you could sort of justify it. But then as time went on, by the time he left Calvin, he was calling himself a free thinker. And sadly, by the time he died a couple of years ago, he was a full-blown naturalist. He said, there really was no evidence of any sort of God or creator. And then similarly, there was a megachurch pastor in the Seattle area who was profiled in Time magazine, Ryan Meeks, as a new breed of evangelical pastor who was recognizing that we need to be more affirming. And so they were okaying with gay marriage. Well, if you go to the church website now, it doesn't exist, because in the years after that, they also abandoned belief in Jesus, and the church, thankfully, in my view, basically went out of existence. But if you look at where this pastor is today, he has a new website, Ryan Meeks, you can look it up, where he and his wife, their new thing is to help people on psychedelic journeys to follow themselves using psychedelic drugs. And so this happens, I've seen this again and again, where, once you go off the rails and you're looking at the wrong authority structures, it doesn't stop. So yes, the sexual suicide chapter, I intentionally started in that chapter. A lot of the chapter deals with heterosexual issues. I do get into transgender, I do get into same-sex issues, but I do think here that sometimes, and this is along the same lines of what you're saying, we like to look at the other person or the other thing, and so it's gay marriage is bad or transgender, and I fully agree with that and do deal with that. But I think the beginning of what I call sexual suicide started way before. And the sexual revolution, and I talk about some of the Darwinian underpinnings of that with Kinsey and things, really infected the church with heterosexual relationships. And I give this example of poor Hannah Brown, who's just a really tragic example, who was on Bachelorette and a few years ago, and she defined herself as an evangelical Christian, but she ends up boasting about having one-night stands with people. And when she was called out on it, she said, well, Jesus still loves me. Well, yeah, but she was boasting in just flouting that. And yet she was not, here's the key thing, she wasn't raised in Los Angeles or in Seattle. She was raised in the Bible Belt in Alabama. And I think the most, I don't know her particular church or pastor, and people do their own things, but what a tragedy. This isn't just a problem, if you're living in mid-America, the problems I'm talking about, it's not just in Seattle, Los Angeles, or San Francisco. It's in Alabama, it's in Texas, it's in, mid-America. And so if we don't get that right, and then also I talk about my own, when I was an elder, our ability of dealing with divorce. And I know, Christians have legitimate differences of opinions of what biblical grounds of divorce are, but they all agree that there are biblical and unbiblical grounds for divorce, and that certainly no fault divorce is not something to be, that's not a good thing. Yet this is another area where, because a lot of people have gone through divorce, a lot of people have been victimized by divorce, by either husbands or wives who have
Yeah.
abandoned the marriage. We don't talk about it, but that failure to actually give
Yeah.
good teaching and discipleship in heterosexual relationships sort of set us up for all the other things that happen. And so I think that if we're wanting to get back to authentic witness there, we need to first start with heterosexuality and not ignore the others. But I mean, we can't just talk about, I think for some, it's so easy just to, oh, gay marriage is bad because I never do that. Well, okay, that's not the only issue.
Right. Yeah, no, it's so true. In fact, I think one of the things I've talked about on the podcast before is that we're seeing unprecedented numbers of quote unquote Christian evangelical couples living together before they get married. And they go to church on Sunday and then they go home to their apartment and they're not married. And there's just doesn't seem to be very clear teaching maybe on it from the pulpit. Or, I mean, I'm certainly hope that that's not the case in every church, but it is it's a conundrum to me how so many, and I'll even meet people, it's like, oh yeah, they just kind of shrug it off like it's not a big deal. But you're right. It's like the Christian sexual ethic is not something that just applies to one area.
And I write about a really tragic story, and that was while I was writing the book, about this couple. I think it was in West Virginia. I'm now actually spacing out on the state. Maybe it was Tennessee, but who were Christians. They met each other. They were both married, and they ended up falling in love and ended up basically divorcing their partners. And they sort of admit that, well, maybe that wasn't great. But then their takeaway in their interviews was, well, but this shows we should follow our heart. So they didn't
Mm.
really actually
Yeah.
understand that what they did was wrong. And again, we need to get our own house in order. But the good news is, on this case, and also in the biblical authority on, is that our actions do matter. So one of there's been a lot of evidence that, there's the rampant, unfortunately, of multiple sex partners before and outside of marriage among Christian young people. I mean, we're not just talking about, I mean, it's bad enough. You shouldn't be living together before married, but we're talking about people who are having 3, 4, 5 partners.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just like, but the good news is that if, for people who actually are trained and actually say, I know that it's wrong, they are much more likely to follow what the Bible says. In other words, the key thing is, and I cite some research from a researcher at Grove City College who did a really good book a couple of years ago, that if you actually look, that people who are intentional and who are really do believe that there's a right and wrong on this, their behavior does reflect it. I mean, none of us are perfect, but the statistics are significantly different. The real defining factor is, have you actually discipled these people so that they know that it's wrong and why it's wrong, and they know what's good? That will impact their behavior. Similarly, on the Bible authority, we are living in the light of, I tell a story that I found out late in the research of the book. I'm not a Lutheran, but I heard this, I learned about this first from actually the daughter of a professor who was involved, the story of how the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod really sort of was saved in the 1970s. This was before the changes in and actually gave inspiration to some of the people in the Southern Baptist Convention later to sort of get their own house in order. They had the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod had a seminary where basically all the professors were now going into the higher critical, teaching the Bible. They were rejecting biblical authority. And so it was a real wake-up call. And the denomination, after several years of trying to deal with this, did basically uphold their standards. And they were called Pharisees, unloving, ungodly, all this, but they stuck to their guns. It was costly. Basically, 90% of the faculty and students, these were their future pastors, left. And so
Mm.
everyone at the time said, oh, they've destroyed the denomination, like 200 or 300 congregations left. They've destroyed the denomination. They've destroyed their seminary. But, God honored that faithfulness. The Missouri Synod Lutheran Church today is the largest conservative, theologically denomination in the nation with 1.8 million, I think, baptized members. And that God honored that faithfulness. Whereas if you actually track with the professors and students who left and ultimately joined what today is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which despite its name is not evangelical,
Not at all.
they
Yeah.
were leaders in redefining marriage, in all sorts of issues in that denomination. So you could actually see in real history the effects of both biblical faithfulness or not. Had they not stood up at the time, they would have become like the ECLA. But because they did, God actually honored it. But it did take wisdom and courage and love to not just harshly strike back, but say, well, no, here we stand. This is our biblical confession, and we're going to hold you to it. But so there's benefits of there's a blessing of faithfulness, and I think in sexuality you see that same thing, that where people aren't actually discipled in the right way, you actually see something beautiful. And I think that is what we should always hold. And then part of my book, and I think we'll get to this, is also, what do we do about it? And the thing is that biblical faithfulness, we do have struggles, and I'm not saying that it's not a gospel of health and wealth, but God honors in various ways our faithfulness. Mm-hmm. And he's so loving and caring. And so if people may be distraught that, well, there's nothing I can do. There is. God is not calling you to solve all the problems of the world. He will do that. He's calling you to be faithful. Yeah. And he will bless your faithfulness, in various ways, even this side of heaven, but then ultimately, obviously, in eternity.
Yeah, yeah. And being faithful for each individual person is going to look different, and it might seem like little small things. For example, I talk with many people when I go out and speak, and a lot of public school teachers will come to me and say, I'm being pressured to put the sticker on my door that says I'm a safe space, and I want to be a safe space, and I am a safe space, but I know what they think that means. And so if I put the sticker on my door, it means I'm affirming of sinful behaviors, and I just, what do I do? And it's like even the college kids or high school kids that I'll meet that are asking about, well, isn't it more polite just to use the pronoun that my friend is wanting me to use so that we can have conversations? And it's the little tiny, what seem to be small compromises that every single one of us are facing, right? We talk about, battles over inerrancy and in institutions. Those are kind of the big macro battles that people, have big platforms and might have influence in certain places are having. But every single Christian has a little potential to be faithful, whether that's in, telling your boss maybe, I'm not going to put pronouns in my bio on my LinkedIn profile, and if that's a requirement or something, or figuring out a different way to go about things. And so that can be something that I think every single Christian, especially in 2025, is applicable. Now, I do want to for sure get to the what do we do about it part, but one thing I want to talk about before we get there, because I haven't talked a ton about this on the podcast, and you had a really good chapter on this, and this might surprise some people, but part of Stockholm Christianity or Stockholm Syndrome Christianity is an abandonment of religious liberty. Now, for some people, it might feel like you just went from all these moral and ethical issues to like politics. But you can't really, I'm learning, you can't separate these things. If you're a Christian, you're going to be a Christian in every area of your life. And not, just because the world says something is political now doesn't mean that you can just abandon your brothers and sisters in Christ who are being faithful in situations where they need good politics to help them out. For example, you tell a story about a community college in Maryland who denied a Christian student entry to its radiation therapy program because they had asked him what the most important thing in his life was, and he answered, "My God," and they denied him entry. I mean, that's a small act of faithfulness that had a huge result in that kid's life. So talk about Stockholm Syndrome, Christians' abandonment of religious liberty.
Yeah. I am a former poli-sci professor, so you can't completely get the politics out of me. You're right that most of my book doesn't focus on politics, and I did that for a reason, not because I don't think that there are applications, but one of the cheap ways people try to get out of this is say, well, you're just talking about politics and you're just being partisan or this. And so I tried to not leave them that out by the way I focus the book, not because I don't think there are implications. But on religious liberty, this is an area that, we're called to obey God. And so if we're called by the government to do something that's against our faith, I mean, we have to obey God. And so this is something I think all Christians ought to be in concert about defending this for each other. And yet it's one of the biggest disappointments, many that, and so it's not, and this is another example of it's not just the secularists who are doing it. Yeah, it is the secular ACLU. I get that, but again and again, you have Christian ministers. Let's just take about the bakers and the photographers and others who want to serve everyone, but they don't want to be conscripted to become part of a same-sex wedding, because
Right.
that and the number of Christian ministers, Andy Stanley is one, but there are many others I cite who were basically demonizing the Christians who didn't want to be forced to participate in gay weddings is appalling.
Yeah.
And then there were many more who would speak out. And then the number of self-identified Christians who actively persecute. In our state, we have an attorney general who's now, unfortunately, our governor, Bob Ferguson, who wore his Catholic identity on his sleeve when he ran for office. He would write about how he was he was an active member of his Catholic church. He went after and drove out of business a grandmother, a Christian grandmother named Baronelle Stutzman in our state, who was a florist. And again, she would sell flowers to everyone, but she would not create special arrangements to honor a gay wedding. They could buy the flowers for her, but she didn't want to participate and actually actively participate. And she should have been able to do that. Her chief persecutor in our state was not an atheist. It was a self-described Catholic Christian who actually wrote an article at the time using his faith as justifying what he was doing to her. And similarly during COVID, and I know there are different sort of opinion during COVID, but I think all Christians should have at least been able to agree that if things were well enough that you could open up casinos,
Right.
that you should at least be able to open up churches with the same
And strip
level of
clubs.
restrictions.
Yeah. They had strip
Yeah,
clubs
that's
open
true.
and yeah.
And marijuana dispensaries. But in Nevada, it was the big casinos. Again, you had a devout, mass-going Catholic governor who did that. And then when it went up all the way up to the Supreme Court, who was the deciding vote that basically allowed them to open up casinos but continue to have onerous restrictions on churches? It was not even a Democrat. It was Chief Justice Roberts, who at the time he was appointed by evangelical Christian George W. Bush. He was a member of a very conservative Catholic group, and so you have these Christians who are actually rubber stamping and even enabling the persecution of their fellow Christians. And I think this is wrong, and that this is an area that I think all pastors and other Christian leaders need to really be clear about. Because if you're not, I think a lot of these people, so they're the people who are actually enabling it, then there are the people who are silent and say, oh, well, that's politics, so we can't do it. And they keep not doing it until then they find out that there's nothing left when they want to
Yeah.
practice their religion. And so this was sort of attempted to be a wake-up call, both and people who are, there's also a lack of spine. So Mike Pence, devout evangelical Christian. I know people have different ideas about him because of the first Trump administration and that. But before that, he was governor of Indiana, and they passed a good religious liberty law that was going to protect the rights of bakers and florists and others. And after about a week of bad publicity, he basically just cowered, and they
Wow.
gutted the legislation, passed new legislation that basically stripped out those protections. And what's even worse, in his autobiography, if you read it, he makes it sound like he stood firm. He writes it in a way, and in fact, I got in a little bit of an argument with a friend on social media who said, well, no, I'm sure that he stood up. You're misportraying. No, I didn't. And so Christians really do need to have a wake-up call, I think, about religious liberty.
Yeah, very good. Well, gosh, this has been jam-packed. As we close out here, I do want to talk about your calls to, you have a call to wisdom, a call to action, and a call to faithfulness. Close us out with what are some ways we can be wise, we can act, and
Yeah.
continue to be faithful as Christians today.
Well, to be wise, I think they should read some of your books, because I see a lot of similarities. So on one thing, I have the misuse of language, and I know in your book
Mm.
on deconstructing Christianity, you point out
Yeah.
that when we adopt these terms that actually have a fundamentally bad meaning, and we try to baptize them, it doesn't work out well, because we can't redefine what the culture is saying something is. So other examples are gay Christians, or even Darwinian evolution, which in essence, in the mainstream view, is unguided. If you try to baptize these terms, you basically end up spreading confusion. And this is a way that things like Stockholm Syndrome Christianity spread. So I think be very careful about the use and abuse of language. Also, relationships. A lot of, growing up, the lingo that I always heard, Christianity is relational. That's true. It is relationship with the living God, with Jesus, and with each other. I agree with that. But I've also seen that term used as a cover time and again to say, well, Christianity is relational, so you can't really stand up for truth in this, or you can't do that. And it's used as an excuse. Well, I want to point out, and I point out in the book, relationships are important, but they're not the highest importance, and they should be in correspondence to the truth. I mean, two of the most relational groups in life are gangs and the mafia, where relationship is and personal loyalty is everything. I think everyone realizes, well, that can get dysfunctional, and so Christianity is relational, but don't allow that to be a cover. And so those are a couple things dealing with wisdom. But on the chapter where I give 21 practical things people can do, the name, well, actually, one of the most important, and it may not seem important, but is the concept of do no harm. So I think Christians should be salt and light. They should be doing good things, but at the least, don't be enabling the bad things. And so by do no harm, take stock of how do you spend your time, talent, and treasure? Are you writing a check? Maybe you were a graduate of a Christian university 20 years ago that was really good, but even it's really now gone in a different direction. But the heartstrings are pulled every time they ask for money. And so you write them an annual check because of your warm feelings from 20 years ago, but you're actually enabling something is wrong. Don't do that. So how at least, even if you're not giving to good things, I think you should give to good things, but make sure you're not bankrolling bad things. Similarly, where are you volunteering your time? And I don't think people should leave churches willy-nilly. The last church my wife and I were at before our current church, we were there 18 years. And we're very active, and it took a lot for us to consider why we left. But on the other hand, there are bright lines in the sand. And I know in our own area, this wasn't a church we went to, but a mega church that was historically more evangelical, where the pastor just came out and accepted a redefinition of marriage. Well, that should have been an easy question for people to not go there, if they couldn't change it, to not go there. But we know families who, our friends are there, our social groups are there. They just couldn't bring themselves. So they're actually enabling something they know to be wrong. So do no harm. Take stock of your own thing. And then, we're not called to be Atlas, that the universe is on our shoulders. We're called to be faithful in the areas God has called us. So, what are you doing with your own family? Who's raising your kids? I mean, this is a basic thing. Is it social media? Is it the public schools? Or are you raising your kids? And, there are various ways to do that. Even if you send them to public schools, you can supplement it. But who is really raising your kids? Don't farm it out to 1 hour a week youth group or something. That isn't going to cut it. And so these are some things that, it's not rocket science, but I think a lot of people need to ask themselves these questions.
Yeah, and honestly, I really want everyone to pick up the book, because we could do a whole 2 or 3 episodes just on this call to action chapter. It's so jam-packed with really practical advice. Equip yourself for the battle, do no harm. And it's got very specific advice even for parents and for students and what grandparents can do. So I really just want to thank my guest, John G. West, for this wonderful interview and for writing this book, Stockholm Syndrome, it's hard to say, Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, Why America's Christian Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. Pick up the book. Spend some time with it. Pray, ask the Lord to show you areas in your own life where you can be courageous and speak truth into lies that are coming in, even if it's coming in from your own pastor, maybe your friend group, your small group. How can we, in a loving and truthful way, be bold and not and stem the tide of the drift? Because I've talked about this before, that the natural movement of any institution, if you're not really being intentional to stop the drift, you will drift. That's why the Bible warns us about this time and time again. So pick up the book. Thanks again to my guest. And let's remember, as we pursue Christ, to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.